Marcus Reed returned to the town he once called home after years away. A tall black man with broad shoulders and deep-set eyes, his presence was impossible to ignore. But it wasn't the kind of attention anyone would welcome. As he drove through the familiar streets, he barely recognized them: run-down houses, peeling facades, and faded signs. Yet it was the stares that unsettled him the most. The cautious, piercing looks from passers-by told him everything. He could feel the silent judgment, the unspoken words. This place no longer felt like home, but turning back wasn't an option. His house stood at the end of the street, in the same neighborhood where he had grown up. Once a vibrant community filled with laughter and children's games, now it seemed lifeless, abandoned. As he pulled up, Marcus saw what had become of his family home. The windows were shattered, the door hung off its hinges, and the walls were covered in crude graffiti. Each word, each slur scrawled across the surface, was a dagger to his heart. The message was clear: he wasn't welcome here. Stepping out of his car, Marcus moved deliberately, his face a mask of calm. But inside, emotions churned: anger, sorrow, memories of how his parents had built this house with hope for a brighter future. He climbed the broken steps and entered. The floor was littered with shattered glass, the furniture smashed, the walls scorched with fire. This wasn't vandalism, it was a declaration. Marcus understood the message all too well. As a black man returning to a town where many preferred his absence, this was their way of trying to drive him away. But if they thought he'd run, they were sorely mistaken. This was his home, and he had no intention of leaving. Running his hand along the charred wall, Marcus exhaled slowly. He knew this was only the beginning. Whoever had done this wouldn't stop. They'd be watching, waiting for their next move. But Marcus wasn't new to adversity. His years in the military had taught him patience, discipline, and how to stand firm under pressure. These would be his weapons now. Laughter echoed from outside. Marcus looked up and peered through the window. Across the street stood a group of men. Their faces were marked with hostility as they stared him down. One of them, a tall man with a neck tattoo, shouted loudly, "You shouldn't have come back, Reed. You don't belong here." Marcus didn't respond. He held their gaze, his expression calm, unflinching. They wanted to see him break, to show weakness. But he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, he straightened his back and shut the door. It hadn't even been an hour, and the town was already testing him. Marcus knew the challenges ahead would be even greater, but he was ready. This was his fight, and he wasn't about to lose. Marcus woke early to a loud, insistent knock on the door. The dull thuds echoed through the house, stirring memories he'd rather forget. Remembering the door still hung precariously on a single hinge, he hurried downstairs, bracing for the worst. Opening it, he was met with the cold stare of the local sheriff. "We've got a report you've been causing trouble," the sheriff said, his gaze drifting past Marcus's shoulder as if searching for evidence to back his claim. Marcus didn't reply right away, letting the silence stretch, thick with tension. He knew full well he hadn't done anything but try to reclaim his life. "I don't think I've done anything to warrant your concern," he finally said, his tone calm but firm. The sheriff leaned in slightly, his eyes hard and piercing like a winter frost. "People aren't too happy about you being back, Reed. Best you keep things quiet if you want this to go smoothly." Marcus held back a bitter smile. A smooth existence here didn't depend on him, and he knew it. The sheriff's gaze only solidified his suspicion that the local system was as rotten as the walls of his vandalized home. As the door shut, anger churned in Marcus's chest. This visit was no coincidence. It was the first step in an orchestrated effort to drive him out. But fear was the last thing he felt. If anyone thought they could break him, they clearly didn't know him. The morning was spent cleaning the house. Marcus methodically replaced shattered windows with makeshift boards and scrubbed the soot-streaked walls. His hands, once accustomed to wielding weapons, now gripped rags and hammers. Occasionally, footsteps echoed outside. Someone was watching, waiting for him to falter. But every hammer strike and every clean surface was a declaration that he wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't just rebuilding a house, he was reclaiming his right to exist. By evening, the tension in the air was palpable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretched across the street, and the atmosphere grew heavier with the promise of coming conflict. Marcus noticed the subtle rustling of movement near his windows. Nightfall was both an ally and an enemy. Sitting on the floor near the window, Marcus held a knife he'd found in an old drawer. His thoughts wandered back to his years in service, where threats were visible, not hidden behind the masks of neighbors. He remembered the laughter of comrades and their promises to return home, promises many couldn't keep. The deep silence of the night felt oppressive. But Marcus knew it was deceptive. Night was the time for those too cowardly to act in daylight. His instincts proved correct. Just as he began to doze off, the sharp sound of breaking glass pierced the quiet. Marcus bolted upright, his heart pounding. Grabbing a flashlight, he cautiously stepped outside. A few feet from his porch lay a rock wrapped in a paper bag. The bag bore a single word scrawled in bold letters: "Leave." Marcus's fists clenched. This was both a warning and a challenge. Returning to the house, he sat at the table and began drafting a list of what needed to be done. It wasn't just a plan, it was a survival strategy. "They want a war," he muttered to himself, his voice resonating in the hollow room. "Then a war is what they'll get." Marcus stepped onto the porch early in the morning, the cold wind cutting through him like a blade. Yesterday had been tense, and the night was a test of endurance. The rock with its menacing message now sat on his table, a constant reminder that peace here was an illusion. Weak sunlight filtered through the gray clouds, painting the streets in pale hues. The town woke slowly, as though every resident sought to hide from the day ahead. Marcus surveyed the neighboring houses, their shutters drawn tight, yards eerily empty. No one approached him, no one asked how he was or offered help. His eyes lingered on the house across the street. Behind the curtains, a shadow moved. Someone was watching. Clenching his fists, he pretended not to notice and descended the porch steps. His destination was the auto shop on the edge of town, where he hoped to find tools to continue repairing his house. As he walked through the empty streets, Marcus felt the weight of wary gazes from behind windows and occasionally heard doors clicking shut in his wake. The town clearly didn't want him here, but that only strengthened his resolve to stay. When he arrived at the shop, the doors were locked. A sign reading "Closed" hung on the door, though the posted hours suggested otherwise. Nearby, scrawled on the pavement in crude lettering, were the words, "You're not welcome here." Marcus didn't dwell on it. If they thought this would deter him, they were gravely mistaken. Returning to his house, he couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every corner, every tree seemed to harbor a hidden presence. At a crossroads, he stopped abruptly and looked back. The street was empty, but in the shadow of a nearby building, something shifted. He said nothing, but his eyes hardened. Back at home, Marcus sat at his table, where an old map of the town lay spread out. Its edges were frayed, marked with notations from years past. He began planning his next move, strategizing how to expose those orchestrating this campaign of fear. Every time he looked at the map, memories of the past surfaced, voices of comrades he'd lost, their hopeful faces etched into his mind. Night approached, and Marcus braced for another sleepless vigil. This time he was prepared. As the streetlights outside dimmed, he hauled an old generator from the shed, one of the few items left intact. Hours of work later, he had rigged floodlights around the house, bathing the yard in harsh, unyielding light. As he finished, he noticed a car parked in the distance. The driver didn't emerge, but their silhouette was visible through the windshield. They were watching. But now Marcus was ready for their games. Before heading to bed, he sat at the table again, staring at the map. He knew this was only the beginning. The war they had forced on him hadn't started here. It had begun long ago, the first time he encountered injustice. His grip on the pencil tightened, and his mind returned to the night he lost a friend. The memories were painful, but they fueled his determination. The faint patter of rain broke the silence. It began softly, then grew louder, as if nature itself underscored the tension. Marcus rose to check the doors and windows, ensuring everything was secure. He lit an old lamp and settled into a chair, listening to the rain drum against the roof. With every raindrop, it felt as though the town's tension deepened. This place lived and breathed hatred and fear. But Marcus was ready to stand his ground, no matter the cost. Marcus spent the day in his house, which still resembled a battlefield. The floodlights he had set up the night before illuminated the yard, keeping the darkness at bay, but inside, the atmosphere was even gloomier. Repairs were slow. Every plank and beam reminded him of how much work lay ahead. Yet, the physical labor kept his mind occupied. The morning outside was unnervingly quiet. No footsteps, no voices. It was as if the whole town had frozen, watching him from a distance. Marcus had grown used to the tension, but today felt different. Something heavier hung in the air. He slowly opened the kitchen window to let in some fresh air. The cool breeze filled the room, carrying with it a faint smell of smoke. Marcus frowned. The scent grew stronger, sharp and acrid. He stepped outside and spotted a gray column of smoke rising in the distance beyond the houses. His heart pounded. Something had happened, and his instincts told him it was connected to him. Quickly donning his jacket, he stepped into the yard to get a better view. The road to the site was empty, but each step echoed loudly in his mind. Finally, he arrived at an abandoned lot near the woods. Here stood old workshops, long deserted by their owners. One of the buildings was ablaze, flames consuming the roof and sending up thick black smoke. Marcus stopped, scanning the area. No one was in sight, but recent activity was evident: fresh tire marks on the ground, footprints near the door. He approached cautiously, assessing the fire's reach. As the flames began to die down, he noticed familiar words scrawled on the wall: "You're next." The message, painted crudely, left no room for interpretation. It was a challenge. Marcus stood motionless, staring into the fire that had already consumed half the building. He knew the time to act had come. Back at home, he spent the rest of the day inspecting his supplies. Every corner of the house was checked for vulnerabilities. Beneath the floorboards, he uncovered several metal boxes left by the previous owners. Inside were old tools, some of which might prove useful. As evening fell, the silence around the house grew oppressive. The floodlights burned brightly, but beyond their glow lurked a darkness that seemed alive. Marcus sat by the window, watching the street. He could feel the town wasn't just observing him, it was preparing. Near midnight, a noise came from the backyard. A dull thud, like footsteps on gravel. Marcus rose slowly and grabbed a flashlight. He stepped outside, moving as quietly as possible. The yard appeared empty, but something drew him toward the garage. Inside, he found an open window that hadn't been that way in the morning. On the table lay a photograph, his photograph. It had been cut down the middle, a clear symbol of division, of destruction. In the corner was a piece of charcoal, likely used to scrawl the messages in the workshop. Marcus returned to the house, the photo in his hand. It was another warning, another message, but fear wasn't an option. He knew this was more than just a gang. This was a system accustomed to unchecked power. But now, that system faced someone who wouldn't be intimidated. He sat at the table and unfolded the map once more. Several locations were already marked, places where he planned to gather evidence or uncover answers. A plan was forming in his mind. Tomorrow he would meet with Emma and share what he had discovered. Marcus woke early, his sleep interrupted by a short but vivid nightmare. Memories of his time in the military had resurfaced once again. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the shadows on the walls. These memories always returned when the pressure became unbearable. The morning light filtered through the thick curtains, flooding the room with a cold gray glow. Outside, it was silent, too silent. It was the kind of silence that foreshadows a storm. Marcus approached the window and looked out onto the street. His house stood out among the others, grim and seemingly on edge. The floodlights were still on, but they didn't offer much comfort. He noticed a few passers-by walking quickly, avoiding lingering near his home. His plan for the day was simple but required focus. Today, he intended to meet with Emma to discuss potential next steps. Her reports on the gang's connections with local authorities were just the beginning, but they needed to be reinforced with new evidence. Marcus pulled out an old army bag where he kept some personal belongings. Among them was a journal in which he documented recent events, photographs that reminded him of the past, and a map of the town marked with red points highlighting key locations. He decided that his first task would be to revisit the site of yesterday's fire. There might still be evidence proving it was arson rather than an accident. The walk to the workshops felt endless. The gray asphalt underfoot, worn paths, and occasional cars created an eerie sense of emptiness. When he reached the site, traces of smoke still lingered in the air, and the smell of burning would cut through the cool morning breeze. Marcus began carefully examining the area. Scattered remains of charred wood and bricks lay around, but something caught his eye. In the corner near the entrance, he found a metal plate with an engraved serial number. It could have been part of the equipment used to start the fire. He carefully wrapped the plate in cloth and placed it in his bag. Then he noticed another anomaly: footprints around the building leading into the forest. They were fresh, likely made overnight. Marcus decided to follow them. The trail led deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, and light barely penetrated their thick canopy. Marcus's heart pounded with caution, but he pressed on. Finally, he emerged into a small clearing and spotted a group of men. They stood around a car, speaking in low voices that were barely audible. Marcus hid behind a tree and observed. Among the group, he recognized a few faces he had seen at Brian's house. The men passed bags among themselves before one of them pulled out a paper package and unwrapped it. Inside were bundles of cash. Marcus realized this was likely part of the corruption scheme. His instincts told him to leave before he was spotted. But before he could retreat, a branch snapped under his foot. The men's heads turned toward him. Marcus's heart raced, but he kept his composure. At that moment, he knew any mistake could cost him his life. Without waiting for someone to move toward him, he began to back away slowly, trying not to draw attention. Once he was at a safe distance, he quickened his pace, then broke into a run. When he finally reached his house, the sun had risen higher, bathing the streets in bright light. Marcus shut the door behind him, breathing heavily. He knew his discovery could become a critical piece in exposing the gang, but he also understood that he had now become an even greater threat to them. Marcus sat at the table, spreading out the city map and his notes before him. The metal plate he had found that morning lay beside him, gleaming with a cold, metallic sheen. Every detail was becoming a piece of the puzzle, yet the full picture still eluded him. One thing was certain: the threat posed by Brian's gang was growing more dangerous by the day, and time was running out. Glancing at the clock, he realized that his search and return home had taken longer than expected. The house was eerily quiet, interrupted only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. The street outside looked deceptively calm, but Marcus knew better. He could feel the invisible threads of danger tightening around him. He stood, stretching his stiff muscles. His gaze fell on the backpack containing the collected evidence. He understood the need to act cautiously but quickly. The metal plate could be crucial evidence if handled correctly. Perhaps Emma could leverage her connections to conduct an independent analysis. Marcus decided to head to Emma's office. Her small workspace was located on the outskirts of town in an old brick building rarely visited by outsiders. The streets were deserted, with only a few cars passing by, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. A cold wind bit through his jacket, making him shiver. When he arrived at the office, Emma was already waiting. She sat at her desk, bent over her laptop. Her hair fell messily over her face, and her eyes were tired but focused. She looked up as Marcus entered, silently gesturing for him to take the chair opposite her. He placed the metal plate on the desk without a word. Emma picked it up, scrutinizing it closely before pulling out her phone to take several photos. She understood its potential significance but also recognized the danger any leak of information could bring. "It's industrial equipment," she finally said, more to herself than to him. "We need to trace where it came from." Marcus nodded. He knew time wasn't on their side. Brian and his crew had likely already noticed the plate's disappearance and would start looking for it soon. They spent the next several hours studying maps and discussing possible locations where the rest of the equipment could be stored. Emma suggested investigating old warehouses on the city's eastern outskirts, rumored to be one of the gang's operational hubs. It was a risky move, but Marcus knew they were running out of options. As evening fell, they decided to scout the area. Emma insisted on accompanying him despite Marcus's objections. She donned a dark jacket and sturdy boots, preparing for the long night ahead. Reluctantly, Marcus agreed. He needed her help and knew going alone would be more dangerous. They moved quietly, avoiding well-lit areas. The warehouse they targeted was in a derelict part of town with little to no lighting. Abandoned buildings surrounded them, long forgotten by the city. It was the perfect hiding spot for the gang. When they reached the warehouse, Marcus paused, scanning the surroundings. Darkness cloaked potential dangers, but he felt they were being watched. He motioned for Emma to stay behind as he moved closer to the building, advancing from one cover to another. Inside, the warehouse was silent, but it was an unnatural silence. It pressed down on him, a constant reminder that anything could happen at any moment. Marcus advanced cautiously, gripping his flashlight tightly. Suddenly, movement flickered in the far corner of the warehouse. Marcus froze, holding his breath. He heard muffled voices but couldn't make out the words. They could be gang members or someone else entirely. He signaled Emma to stay put and continued toward the source of the sound. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. Every step brought him closer to danger, but retreat was not an option. Marcus knew this night could be a turning point. The dark sky loomed over the warehouse like an impending threat. Marcus stood at the edge of the musty structure, listening intently to every sound. His breathing slowed and his body tensed, ready for whatever might come. Emma remained behind, her figure hidden in the shadows of old crates, as he gestured for her to stay put. The warehouse reeked of dust and rust. The floor was covered with a thick layer of grime that crunched underfoot. Marcus moved as carefully as the circumstances allowed. His eyes were fixed on the far corner, where he had seen movement. All the experience he had gained over the years was concentrated in this single moment. He relied on his instincts, as though he were back on a mission. He knew hesitation could cost him his life. Dull footsteps echoed off the warehouse walls. Marcus's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and in the dim light, he made out silhouettes. Two men stood nearby, their voices low and tense. They were discussing something in hushed tones, but Marcus couldn't make out the words. One of them bent down, pointing to something on the floor, while the other straightened, glancing around. At that moment, the sound of footsteps ceased. The silence was oppressive, as though the air itself had stilled. Marcus took another step forward, trying to remain invisible. The floor creaked underfoot, and the figures abruptly turned. Inside, everything tightened. For a fraction of a second, he felt goosebumps crawl over his skin, but there was no room for fear to take hold. He crouched behind a crate, drawing the folding knife from his pocket, the only weapon he had on him. The faces in the shadows showed nothing but alertness. One of the men reached into his pocket, and Marcus knew it might be for a weapon. He held his breath, watching intently. Suddenly, one figure moved toward the exit, but the second one stayed behind. The remaining man pulled out a phone and began typing something. Marcus squinted, noticing the phone's screen reflecting light like a beacon in the dark. This second seemed decisive. Marcus waited a moment longer, then lunged forward. His movements were swift and precise, like in a training exercise. He grabbed the man's wrist, causing the phone to fall to the floor. The man struggled, but Marcus intercepted his other hand, pinning him against the crates. "Who are you?" the man hissed, but Marcus didn't respond. This was no time for words. The thud of the dropped phone echoed faintly, and the man outside turned at the sound. Marcus couldn't afford a mistake. He quickly assessed the time left before the situation spiraled out of control. Emma, still in the shadows, remained unnoticed. Her small camera was raised, capturing the events. Marcus turned off the phone's light and restrained the man firmly to keep him from moving. However, panic flashed in the captive's eyes, heightening the tension. The man realized he was trapped and began muttering threats. Voices sounded in the distance. Reinforcements were coming. Marcus knew time was running out. He shoved the man against the wall and then abruptly released him, stepping back. "Run," he said tersely, turning to Emma. She hesitated for a moment but quickly followed his lead when she saw the urgency in his expression. They exited the warehouse as quietly as they had entered, disappearing into the night. Their footsteps echoed through the deserted streets until they reached safety. Marcus, breathing heavily, scanned the surroundings, but no one followed them. That was too close, Emma said, pulling off her backpack. She opened it and began reviewing the footage she had captured. Her voice carried relief but also lingering fear. Marcus exhaled deeply and sank onto a wooden crate. His body was still on high alert, but he knew this was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring the next step, uncovering what these people were hiding and how it connected to their goal. The darkness of the night gave way to the faint light of dawn as Marcus and Emma reached the safe house on the outskirts of the city. Their refuge was simple, a rusty old garage with cracked walls. Here, they could at least briefly hide from their pursuers. Marcus checked the doors to ensure they were secure before leaning against the cold metal surface, feeling the tension slowly leave his body. Inside, the silence was palpable. Emma, sinking into a folding chair, immediately began reviewing the footage she had recorded. Her hands trembled, but she tried not to show it. Marcus walked over to her, silently observing her work. The screen displayed glimpses of faces, movements, and muffled sounds. Each fragment held potential evidence against the gang, but the question remained, would it be enough to shake the system protecting these criminals? "It's all here," Emma murmured, finally breaking the silence. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He nodded without saying a word, turning back to the window. Daybreak was coming. The gray sky hung over the city like a thick blanket. Marcus felt the city waking up around him, slowly and reluctantly. It seemed every corner, every crack in the pavement held a story. But to him, this place was hostile, foreign. There was no safety here, only endless confrontation. He turned back to Emma. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, but Marcus noticed her discreetly wiping away tears. It wasn't fear but accumulated fatigue, as if she could no longer bear the weight of everything happening. Marcus sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. Words felt unnecessary, redundant. Instead, he simply placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement that she wasn't alone. They stayed in silence until a faint noise came from outside. Marcus tensed, immediately shifting into high alert. He gestured for Emma to stay put and cautiously approached the door. Through a crack in the metal, he saw a figure moving. It was a man, tall and stocky, with a backpack slung over his shoulder. Marcus didn't know who he was, but it was clear the man was looking for someone or something. He moved cautiously, glancing around as if aware he was being watched. Marcus slowly drew the knife from his pocket, his fingers tightening around the cold handle. He knew he couldn't jump to conclusions, but taking risks was dangerous. Suddenly, the man stopped right in front of the garage. He froze, then knocked on the metal door. Marcus braced himself for the worst. "It's Jack," a muffled voice called. "I need to talk." The name immediately brought the former police officer to Marcus's mind. Jack had recently joined their fight, but trust couldn't be given freely. Marcus glanced at Emma, and she nodded, understanding his hesitation that he opened the door but kept the knife in hand, concealed behind his back. Jack stepped inside, scanning the space. His expression was serious but calm. "We've got a problem," he said, dropping his backpack onto the floor. "They know you're here. We don't have much time." Marcus studied him, searching for any sign of deceit. But everything about Jack's demeanor suggested urgency. Jack unzipped the backpack and pulled out maps, showing routes and layouts of the gang's warehouses. "We have a chance to hit them before they hit us," Jack continued, his voice low but steady. Marcus leaned over the maps, committing every detail to memory. He knew their next move would depend on this information. Yet, an unsettling feeling grew inside him. It seemed like everything happening was part of a larger plan they couldn't yet see. Emma stepped closer, studying the maps intently. Her eyes reignited with energy, a spark of the drive she had seemingly lost hours ago. Marcus could see that she was ready to go all the way, fear or not. "We move now," he finally said, breaking the silence. "There's no time to wait." Jack nodded, packing the maps back into his bag. Marcus felt the tension inside him give way to resolve. They knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but there was no other option. This fight would be decisive. The small group moved through the city, hiding in the shadows of dawn. Marcus led the way, his eyes scanning every movement on the street. Every sound, a creak of a door, the hum of a distant engine, kept him on edge. Jack followed a few steps behind, his footsteps silent like those of a hunter. Emma, trying not to lag, was breathing heavily. The bag of equipment she carried seemed far too heavy for her slight frame. The city awoke slowly but surely. Dim lights began to flicker from windows, shop signs illuminated one by one. Yet, despite the familiar morning sounds, tension lingered in the air. They knew the enemy would not stop until they were eradicated. By the time they reached one of the warehouses on the outskirts, the sky had turned pale. Jack pointed to the building, a massive concrete structure surrounded by old cars and rusting containers. Everything looked abandoned, but they knew weapons capable of destroying their plans lay hidden inside. "Approaching now is risky," Jack said, his voice barely audible over the wind. He unfolded a map on the hood of an old car. "The warehouse is here. Cameras on the corners, guards at the main entrance. The back is likely less secure." Marcus studied the map, noting weaknesses. A plan formed in his mind. Approach from two sides, neutralize the guards, then access the warehouse. Time was critical. The longer they waited, the greater the chance of discovery. Emma stood aside, clutching her bag. She didn't intervene, knowing her role wasn't in tactics but in documenting everything. Her camera was her weapon, but not for this fight. "Ready?" Marcus asked quietly, glancing at Jack. He nodded, checking the knife on his belt. Noise was not an option, silence would be their ally. Marcus moved first, his body blending into the shadows. Each step was precise, as if he felt the ground beneath him. Jack took the opposite side, circling the perimeter. Emma stayed behind, waiting for the signal. The dim light of dawn replaced the night, but darkness lingered in their hearts. The warehouse's backlit was eerily quiet. Only the wind and the creak of metal disturbed the silence. Marcus pressed against the wall, peeking around the corner. His eyes caught a guard near the door. The man seemed relaxed, but Marcus knew a single mistake would trigger an alarm. He crept closer, every movement deliberate. The knife was ready, his breathing steady. In a single moment, everything blurred. Only the target and determination remained. The guard never knew what happened. Marcus gently lowered the body to the ground and moved on. Jack handled the other side with equal precision. His experience as a former police officer allowed him to move as silently as Marcus. They met at the back entrance. Jack produced a crowbar and began working the door open. It gave way with a quiet click. Inside the warehouse, an oppressive silence reigned. Rows of crates covered in tarps stretched deep into the building. Marcus and Jack moved like shadows, their footsteps nearly imperceptible. They knew not all guards would be outside. Every movement was a gamble. Marcus pointed to a far corner where large containers stood. He suspected the weapons were there. They approached cautiously, but before they could inspect the contents, footsteps echoed. The sound grew louder, reverberating through the empty space. Marcus signaled Jack to hide. They ducked behind crates, watching the entrance. Two men entered, one clearly a gang member, the other wearing a uniform. Marcus's heart raced. A policeman. This confirmed the gang had protection at every level. Rage began to boil inside him. This city wasn't just consumed by the gang's darkness but by those sworn to uphold the law. But now was not the time for anger. They waited as the men left, then continued their mission. Emma remained outside, keeping watch. Her heart pounded in sync with her anxiety. She knew every moment could be their last. But despite the fear, she was ready to see this through. The warehouse was engulfed in darkness. Only faint streaks of light from narrow windows sliced through the gloom. Marcus moved forward, each step deliberate and precise. In the tense silence, the faint scuff of boots on concrete and the occasional creak of containers punctuated the stillness. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, already calculating possible escape routes. Jack stayed a few steps behind, careful not to disrupt their coordination. The space inside was larger than they had anticipated. In one corner, rows of metal crates loomed like an iron fortress. Marcus paused briefly, taking in the scene. Everything here pointed to one purpose: preparation for something massive. This wasn't just a warehouse, it was an arsenal. Near the first crate, Jack crouched down to inspect the lock. Despite its simplicity, it was new and sturdy. Marcus pulled out his tools and swiftly cut through the metal. The lock fell with a muted thud. Inside, they found weapons, rows of rifles, boxes of ammunition, even grenades. Marcus frowned. The sheer amount suggested their enemies were gearing up for all-out war. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Marcus froze, signaling Jack to hide. They quickly ducked behind towering crates. A door creaked open, and two men entered, a gang member and a police officer. Their muffled conversation carried fragments of chilling words: shipment, transport, distribution. Each word painted a grim picture. Marcus held his breath, watching as they passed by. The officer's gaze swept indifferently over the warehouse, while the gang members seemed visibly tense. They stopped briefly near a container, checked its contents, then disappeared deeper into the building. Once their footsteps faded, Marcus and Jack emerged from hiding. The situation was escalating and time was running out. The warehouse needed to be destroyed. Marcus silently retrieved small charges from his bag, carefully setting them around the facility. Each movement was methodical, his focus unshakable. Jack watched silently, his face grim. Marcus handed him one of the explosives and motioned toward the far corner. There was no need for words. They both knew what had to be done. When the preparations were complete, they headed toward the exit. Outside, Emma was waiting. Her expression was a mixture of worry and determination. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held the camera steady. She knew her role was to capture every detail, to make sure the world couldn't look away. At a safe distance, Marcus stood still, gripping the detonator tightly. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. He had seen explosions like this before, but each one carried the weight of destruction and the hope for salvation. Pressing the button, he felt the ground tremble. The quiet detonation erupted into a fiery blast. Glass shattered, and a massive plume of smoke rose into the sky, illuminating the dim morning. Emma snapped a few photos, her face focused as if trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. Beside her, Jack stood in silence, staring into the distance. They all understood that this explosion was not the end, it was only the beginning. Marcus turned to them, his voice low but resolute. "We did what we had to. Now it really begins."